Hey guys, my name is Professor Arjun Sondhi, and today we'll talk about what is economics and what does it mean to say that we live in a simple economy. You'll see through examples, whether you like it or not, you're very much an integral part of an economy. Even right now, you listening and me teaching is what is economics. So what does it mean to have a simple economy? A simple economy is where consumers, both you and I, want to buy goods and services. So we buy food, we buy homes, we buy clothes. There are lots of things we buy, and then we also contribute towards producing them. One day when you'll get a job, you will work towards producing these goods. The interaction of these resources is what a simple economy is. So we use resources. You will use your labor. I am using my time right now to teach. A farmer uses their time to grow crops. Labor is a resource. We also have land as a resource and machines. So these are a few examples of resources we use in an economy to produce goods and services. Again, it can be a tangible physical good like food or a house or clothes, or it can be a service, visiting a doctor, going to an accountant, a lawyer, or me providing my service in education here. So we use these resources to produce goods and services to satisfy human wants. Now we have human wants that are unlimited. If you are given 100 rupees, you want 200. If as a family we have one car, we want two, and if we have two, we want three. So it is very important in economics, and that's integral to economics, is how do we use these resources in the most efficient way to satisfy human wants. So that in a nutshell is what is economics. Now next we'll talk about what are the central problems of an economy, what are the questions that has to be answered when we study economics, and then how do we go about achieving the most efficient outcome for an economy. So the three most important questions that we have to answer in an economy is what to produce, and I will elaborate in just a second. What to produce? Do we want as an economy, since resources are scarce and we have to satisfy these human wants that are unlimited, what should we produce? Should we spend more resources on producing more agricultural goods? Should we spend more resources on producing cars? Or should we spend more resources on producing healthcare and education? These are all choices that we have to make, because we cannot possibly produce everything that we want because resources are scarce. The second question is how to produce them. Do we use more labor to produce crops, for example, or do we use more machines and tractors and less labor? That's also a very important question. And the last question is for whom to produce it and how to distribute it in an economy. Whether we want to produce it for a certain group of people in Punjab, or whether we want to produce cars in Hyderabad, and then we have to distribute them all across the country. So what is the most efficient way to do that is also an economics question. So in summary, what we've done so far is what is meant by an economy. And you'll see when you start working, what you're doing right now is very much what economics is. We have to use these resources that are scarce to satisfy these human wants that are unlimited. So that therein lies the most important question in economics, is we have to use these resources very efficiently to satisfy these human wants. And in doing so, we have to answer three questions. What is it first that we want to produce? How do we want to get about producing it? And how do we distribute it amongst the country? So the next topic, which we will get into next time, is called the production possibility frontier. This is a very simple economic model which helps summarize the concepts you have learned today. Is how do we go about producing it? What is an efficient combination of inputs to get to a certain output that we want to get at? So now we're going to get into the next model, which is the production possibility frontier, which helps us determine and gives you some economic concepts of how the different combinations of goods that an economy can produce. Now when you think of a production possibility frontier, it can be both for an individual, it can be for a business, or it can be for a country. So we can narrow it down or broaden it as much as we would like. so we can analyze it at whichever level we would like. So I'll do an example where we look at two commodities that an economy is deciding to produce. So let's start with a simple example for the country. Let's say we pick two goods, food and cars, that a country is deciding to produce between. So we will look at the different combinations and some economic concepts that you will learn along the way. So let me just pick some numbers. So let's say for food, we want to either produce a combination between 0 and 4 units of food. You can think of this as either rice or wheat or anything that might help you understand better. And then for cars, let's say we are going to again pick a combination of different cars to produce. So let me ask you a question before I further go into the example. If a country has a choice between producing 0 food and 4 food, do you think that they will produce the most number of cars when we are producing 0 food, or do you think we will produce the most number of cars when we are producing 4 food? Again, think in terms of if we are using all the resources in an economy to produce these combinations of goods, where do you think the most number of cars can be produced? All right, so I'm sure you guessed correctly that if we are using all of these resources to produce these goods, if I'm producing 0 food, that means I'm using none of the resources towards producing food, which would then mean that I'm using all the resources towards producing cars. So therefore we can produce either 10 cars and 0 food. That is one combination of the two goods that a country can produce given the current resources. So given that we have X hectares of land in India and we have, let's say, 1 million people that are working, and then we have 10,000 machines and 1,000 factories. If those are the resources that are available for us to use, if all of those get used, we are going to be able to produce 10 cars and 0 food. And then as we go down this row, you'll see that the number of cars that we are able to produce has to go down because we now choose to produce more food. So again, let me just write down some numbers here for cars. So you can see that as we want to produce more of one good, we have to give up some of the other, which is a very important economic concept, is that there are trade-offs. If I want more of one, I have to give up something else down the road. So this is a numerical way to understand a production possibility frontier. As you'll see throughout our different classes, that most economic concepts are understood using theory, giving an example, numerically, and then also graphically. It's very important that you understand this concept graphically, as you will be tested on both the numerical part as well as the graphical part. So most economics graphs are drawn on two coordinates. You have an x-axis and a y-axis. I'm going to, for this example, put food on the x-axis, and I'm going to put cars on the vertical axis. So as you've learned in your math class, this is the origin where both units are 0, and then depending on which of these combinations we are producing, we will pick a corresponding point within this area. So let's just graph it out. So when we are producing 0 food and 10 cars, that means we are on 0 at the food axis, and then let's say 10 for cars. So that's one point. And the other extreme case is 4 food and 0 cars. So those are the two extreme cases, and then you're connecting the dots, and as when I asked you the question, the relationship is negative. If I want to produce more food, I have to give up some cars. If on the other hand I want to produce more cars, I have to give up some food. So we'll see that as you draw this relationship, when you have 2 food, you're going to have 9 cars, and so on and so forth. As practice, you should, so I've given you the outline of the graph, I've given you 3 out of the 5 points. You should try to put the remaining points on this graph to make sure that you understand the relationship here before we talk about some concepts relating to the production possibility frontier. So that's the model. Now there are a few important concepts that we're going to talk about within the model. So this line, which is the PPF or the production possibility frontier, tells us what? That tells us that given all these resources, a country or an individual or a society or a business can choose any combination on this line to produce some combination of food and cars. If a country, for example, produces somewhere here, that means they're producing 2 units of food but 5 units of cars or 5 cars, then this country is wasting some resources. So they are producing inefficiently. But any point on this line is an efficient use of the resources. Now there is no one point that's better than the other, that just depends on the preferences of the people in the society. So whether we want to produce 10 cars and 0 food, or 4 food and 0 cars, or 3 food and 4 cars is dependent on the country. So here I've laid out the basic production possibility frontier. Next class we'll summarize this a little bit and then move on to the next topic from the first chapter. So the last thing we talked about was the PPF model, and I'll give you a second to come up with what it stands for before I move on to the next topic. And I'm sure you guessed correctly, that's the production possibility frontier. So that's where we talked about how a country decides if they're wanting to use all their resources, what to produce in what quantities, whether we want to produce more of good A or we want to produce more of good B. Today we're going to conclude chapter 1 by talking about 3 more concepts within a basic economy. So first thing we're going to talk about is the different kinds of economy that there are. So we've talked about we have unlimited wants, we have limited resources, and then how do we produce them. So 2 basic structures of an economy that we can work in. One is a centrally planned economy. So in an economy which is centrally planned, there's a central organization, or we all call that a government, which decides A, what gets produced, B, how we produce them, and C, for whom we produce them. So there is no individual choice or by firms or by consumers, but there's a government that decides all of those choices, and then they just tell the people how much they can buy of each good and what price they're going to pay and all of those questions. The other extreme is called a market economy. A market economy is where, as you can see from the word, the most important term there is the word market. In a market economy, a market determines all those questions that in the centrally planned economy the government did. So in the market economy, the exchanges between goods and services happens without any central organization. So if you think of in the real world, the only purely centrally planned economy today that we have left is probably North Korea. Most economies are a mix of the two, but when you think of centrally planned economies, North Korea is the example that comes in mind. A market economy, since there is no central government, it's important to determine how exchanges take place, right? So if you want to buy more food, you don't have to ask anyone, nobody has to tell you to do so. You just go in the market and you buy it. When you think of a market, again, don't think of a physical place. It can be going to a grocery store is an example of a market, going to your car dealer is an example of a market, going to your classroom is an example of a market. Also, it can be virtual, right? What we are doing here. So me providing education to you, but we are not meeting in person, is also an example of a market. It can be both virtual or physical. Now, one important aspect of a market economy is how do we determine whether I want to buy something and how much I'm willing to pay for that. The key function of a key property of a market economy is that the price of a good determines everything. So in a centrally planned economy, we have the government. That tells us you have to buy 10 cars in Delhi and you have to pay 1,000 rupees. So that's there's no choice made by me. In a market economy, it's the price that determines. So if a price of a car is a lot more than I want to spend, then I will just choose not to buy that car. If on the other hand, if the price of a car is very cheap, then everyone is going to run out to buy those cars, and then the producers will be signaled that they need to raise the price of a car. So we'll talk more about how price works in a market economy when we talk about some concepts later on. But for right now, you need to know that the basic difference between the 2 kinds of economies is one, you have a central planner, and in the other, you have a market that determines everything that gets produced and for whom it gets produced for and how much people pay for it. Now, if you think, like I said, of an example, most economies are somewhere in between, and that's called a mixed economy, where a market determines everything, but we do have some government involvement. If you think of any example, India, US, Germany, they're all mixed economies. The difference is the degree to how much the government intervenes. So that's a basic introduction of the different kinds of economies. A couple of more things before we conclude the chapter is the difference between normative and positive economics. And the last thing is the difference between micro and macroeconomics. So again, as you probably have noticed, chapter 1 is introducing you to a lot of concepts that we will get into in more depth later on. So before we conclude the chapter, we have a couple more things that we have to talk about. One is the difference between normative and positive economic analysis, and lastly, the difference between micro and macroeconomics. Positive economics is what we use to see how the different parts of an economy functions, and then normative economics is how we evaluate them. So for example, if you make a statement such as interest rates going up in an economy leads to lower inflation, or when people have more income they will spend more on goods, those are positive economic statements. You're stating facts rather than your opinions. Normative economic analysis deals more with evaluating how things are. Now when you do that, it is more opinionated and there's more judgment rather than stating facts. So for example, if you say, I think the government should spend more money on infrastructure, or I feel like the government should lower taxes, those are examples of normative statements as opposed to positive statements. And then last thing in the chapter is the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. This class is for microeconomics, which looks at different individual components of an economy. For example, if I ask you, how much do you want to earn when you get your first job? That's a micro question. If I ask how many cars should Tata produce this year, that's a micro concept. All of those are looking at an individual component of an economy, whether it's a consumer like you, or whether it's a producer like Reliance or Tata, or whether it's a government, Reserve Bank of India. All of those are micro concepts. Macro concepts looks at an economy as a whole. So instead of asking how many cars should Tata produce, if we on the other hand ask what is the overall level of production in the Indian economy, that is a macro concept. We are not concentrating as much on one producer in one part of the country. Rather than that, we are looking at a whole economy, which is the whole country. When we talk about macro concepts, we don't focus on one area or one consumer, rather as opposed to the whole economy. So that's so obviously in this class, we will concentrate on micro. So we will evaluate the decisions made by a firm. We will evaluate the decisions made by consumers, which is going to be the next class, is how do consumers, which is you and I, make our decisions. The choices we make, whether to buy more of one or the other good, how do we make those decisions is going to be a micro question, which is what we will get into in the next class. So that concludes chapter 1. We talked about what is economics, what's the purpose of a simple economy, what are the decisions that gets made in an economy, who decides those, whether it's a government or a market, and then some simple concepts that we will keep coming back to as you learn more concepts. So hopefully chapter 1 has convinced you that economics is important. Whether you like it or not, it is every decision you make is an economic decision. You spending time to listen to me lecture you right now rather than going to eat lunch or drink coffee or talk to your friends is an economic decision. So now from the next chapter, we'll start getting into some more elaborate microeconomic models, and you will see that soon enough when we get into the next chapter. Thank you, have a good day, and I will see you next class.